Hi, everybody. We're going to talk about, let's see, the material on for the third video, which is the different levels of analysis. And since sociology covers so much material, we're going to look at both the kind of zoomed in and the zoomed out. And when we think about the macro level, we're generally thinking about the top components of culture. So we start at the top, we have society, which is the big umbrella, and then society is composed of culture, which is all the things that make up a society, all the values and norms, which we talked about, the ways of being, the material culture, non-material culture. Material cultures are the things you can touch in a culture. Like we have wedding bands, and wedding bands have symbolic meaning based on where you wear them, on which hand. And so we have culture, and then we come down into social institutions. And social institutions are where the macro level of analysis tends to focus. And social institutions are the ways that society organizes itself to get its needs met. And they are comprised of things like, which I think I already mentioned a little bit of, the family, religion, and the economy and government, so that we're able to get things taken care of. So if we were looking back at the Brock-Turner case, and doing macro level analysis, we would be looking at, for example, sentencing discrepancies. So sentencing discrepancies would be you would look at similar cases where the defendant was found guilty and look at the sentencing and see if you could find patterns in sentencing. They might be patterns based on whether the defendant has private counsel or public defender. It may be on the color of their skin. It may be on gender. Women are hardly ever charged for sexual assault. But we would look at the factors, right? And that's that inductive reasoning, where we would gather all this data and then look for patterns. And so that would be looking at the macro level. And then social inequality kind of bridges between the two, and it's one of the focuses of sociology, and it's how all societies have resources, and they distribute these resources unevenly based on your membership in certain groups. So depending on the groups you belong to, you have more or less access to particular resources. So for example, women in our culture are much more likely to be poor than men. And there's a reason for this that goes back to our culture, which is that when there is a baby and the people who made the baby are not together, the woman is the one who generally ends up with the baby. And when you have a baby, you're much more likely to be in poverty. So having a child becomes, especially if you're already poor, becomes anchor, kind of keeping you in poverty. And this is a burden that tends to be borne by women and has helped create something we call the feminization of poverty, where the people in poverty tend to be the very old, the very young, and women. So coming down from inequality, we look at groups, the different groups that we belong to. Some groups we belong to by choice, others not by choice. And within the groups that we belong to, we play certain roles. So, you know, we have, well, we actually call them statuses when we get into that part of the book. But like I currently hold the status right now of daughter. I am 50 and my mom is 80, and my mom has Parkinson's, and she's just now, like in the last week, started to have a really serious problem with getting up and down the stairs. And my parents live in a large 3-story 1918 home in the museum district, and it has a lot of stairs, and it has no real way to manage those stairs. Like, you can't put one of the things that rides you up and down the stairs. And for a long time, you know, I probably gave up like a year ago or 6 months ago. You know, I pressured my parents to put in an elevator. They really want to stay in their house. They were like really clear, we really want to stay in our house. And I was like really clear that if you really want to stay in your house, that you really need to make it handicap accessible. And 1918 homes are not handicap accessible. And one way to do that would be to put in an elevator and then make one of the bathrooms upstairs handicap accessible for someone in a wheelchair, because realistically that's where my mom is going to be. But my mom, you know, wanted to kind of stay in this state of denial that that's where things were going. And she said that, and and I, you know, I couldn't, I mean, I can only do so much. And my stepfather balked at the money. My parents have a lot of money, but my stepfather is, you know, was raised during the Depression, and he's 90 years old, and he still feels like he's going to run out of money. No matter how much money he has, he feels like he's going to run out of it. And so, you know, they have things that they could be doing now, like they have a carriage house in the backyard that they converted into a studio apartment, and they have a tenant in there, and they could be, you know, using that to have a caregiver live there. But, you know, they like the check, even though they don't need it. So he didn't want to spend the money, and she didn't want to deal with the, you know, impending reality. And now, you know, last week, my stepfather came to me and he's like, oh my God, she's, you know, falling backwards as she's going up the stairs, and she's gonna fall back into me and knock me down. And, you know, and I was like, yeah. And, you know, so one of the statuses that we hold is being a child, so being a daughter. And as I've gotten older, and as my mom has gotten sicker, the things that I do within that status have shifted. You know, so now I'm kind of in this position of trying to pressure them to plan for this disability that's coming, but you know, they just don't want to do it. Even now, they're still really resistant. So, and that's part of the, you know, the statuses and the roles that we play in society. People have a hard time, you know, giving up their independence, and, you know, it's a very difficult transition. And so this is one of the, when we get down to the micro level and we look at, you know, how do people interact based on the statuses that they hold. So as a daughter, it's, you know, I can only, you know, I don't have the kind of power that I would have as a parent. But as they get sicker, you know, my control over the situation is going to get greater, which is why I hope they would do something now, but I don't think they are. So socialization is, you know, coming kind of down even more into day-to-day life, the micro level. And socialization is a process where we learn how to play all these roles and belong to all these statuses. And socialization is primarily a silent process. It's something that we learn watching television, watching, I forgot to blow this up, watching the, excuse me, watching what our parents do, kind of checking out the world around us and seeing how things play out. And you know, the example I always use in class is like how to ride an elevator. And there's a lot of rules to riding an elevator. And generally, most of these rules we're never told. The only rule I've ever told to my daughter about the elevator is that you wait for people to get off before you try and get on. But other than that, I haven't told her the other rules, and the other rules involve things about where it's okay to look when you're in an elevator, right? If you're facing forward, it's like okay to look at the floors up above the doors, and it's okay to look at the panel with the buttons on it. But you know, outside of that range, things are starting to get sketchy. That when you stand next to the buttons, that you have kind of a temporary job to press the buttons, and you either ask people what floor or you respond when they tell you what floor. There's a kind of dance around space, and when you get on an elevator, there's a focus on kind of maximizing the distance between people. So if you know there's one person on the elevator and you get on the elevator, you don't go stand right next to that person. Or if you do, you're going to make them really uncomfortable, because we've been socialized to maintain certain distances in public, and certainly in a box, we try and have you know, this kind of maximization of space, maximizing of space. And then, you know, there's rules about talking, and basically don't do it, right? There's some circumstances where it's okay, but in general, you don't get on an elevator and strike up a conversation. And I had a student once who said, you know, well, I always talk to everybody I get on an elevator with. And I said, well, nobody likes you. You're violating social norms. And he said, well, I like to do it. And I said, well, that's fine that you like to do it. And, you know, maybe even the people you're talking to like it, but it doesn't mean you're not violating a norm, because you are. And chances are you're making some people uncomfortable. So we're socialized into one part of being in society, which is human interaction. And human interactions are controlled and monitored and modified by what we've learned in the socialization process. So if you look at, for example, at Target, you've been to Target, right? So this is what Target looks like when you go to Target, right? And if you're a girl, give kids aisles works better. So if you're a girl and you go to Target, then you know you're pretty much going to see this, right? And you're going to see the pink aisle and the blue aisle. And there's a lot of socialization that goes on in these aisles, and a lot of teaching kids how to interact. So this kind of human interaction, part of how we learn it is through which toys and activities we're directed towards as children. So in the pink aisle, girls learn how to do the things we want them to do when they grow up, which are not necessarily the most awesome fun things, but are things that society needs to get done. And we traditionally look to women to do these things. So we kind of train them from the beginning. And so the activities in the pink aisle are baby dolls, dressing dolls, putting diapers on dolls, being pretty, fashion, you know, makeup. There's some time, you know, I got my daughter when she was little, like a little cleaning set. It had a broom and a, you know, she never used it. So, and girls tend to interact when they're playing. They tend to kind of play together, right? They'll, like, my daughter is here right now with her friend, and they're playing dinosaurs. My daughter is not a pink aisle kind of girl. And they're playing dinosaurs, and they're sitting on my bed facing each other, creating a little dinosaur world. And that's often how girls play. They play with each other, and there's connection. And that's how we teach women to interact, right? We teach women to do a kind of communication that we'll learn about later that's called being expressive. And expressive communication is about connection and you know, inclusion and kind of getting things done. So on the boy aisle, you'll find a lot of things to do, right? So boys are doers. And so my images aren't working perfectly because Target just did this thing where it decided to change the, not have the toys be so gendered, and everybody went nuts. So on the blue aisle, there are things to do. All right, you blow up things, you make cars, and you race them around a track. Here's a stuffed animal you can play with, but it's a monster, so that's okay. And here's guns to shoot, and stuff to do. And interestingly enough, when boys grow up, this is what we expect them to do stuff. And boys tend to use and men, a kind of communication that we call instrumental communication. And instrumental communication is more about exchanging information and, what are we going to do? What's happening? What's the plan? And boys tend to do more of what's called parallel play. And parallel play is where two boys will sit next to each other and play. And they may be doing the same thing, but they're generally a lot less likely to be in the same world as girls when they play. And I always think about this when I think about, like, if you have at Thanksgiving, right? In Thanksgiving, you'll end up with, stereotypically the men in the living room watching television and yelling at the TV and jumping up and down. And then you'll have the women in the kitchen or in the dining room talking and doing the dishes. And the women have prepared the meal. The women have made the arrangements for Thanksgiving. They've made the plan, whose house it's going to be at, and who's going to cook what. And they're watching over the children to make sure they're okay, and they're creating the world. And the men kind of come to the world and visit, but they haven't had a hand in creating the world. If you think of Thanksgiving as like a play, the men kind of show up stereotypically for the event, but the women have done all the women know who's a vegan and who's upset with who, and the family dynamics and politics, and so all of that we start learning in our pink aisle. And so we learn how to interact differently and come at the world in a different way. And all of this leads down to the sense of self, and this how we see ourselves and how we come to have an identity. And for sociology, the self is something that we develop as we grow up, and it comes from interaction with other people. It's not something that we develop in a vacuum, that we aren't born with our, this kind of core character that we develop. That there are certainly, we are born with tendencies. Some people are born with differences in their brain, but a lot of who we are is based on who we were around and what experiences we had as we were brought up. So I told you all that to tell you this. In sociology, we talk about three main perspectives. So these are kind of three different approaches to looking at the world. And a theory is like a paradigm, right? It's a way to explain how the world works and to kind of use it in terms of what you're going to study and how you're going to look at it. And there are three of them, and two of them are macro. They're big level theories, and one of them is a micro level perspective or theory. And of the two macro level theories, one of them tends to be more conservative and one of them tends to be more liberal. So functionalism is more kind of conservative, not Donald Trump conservative, you know, more like Tom McCain conservative. And conflict theory is more Bernie Sanders liberal, and even more extreme than Bernie Sanders. So functionalism looks at society as kind of like the human body, and that, you know, there's all kinds of systems and they all come together to make a whole, right? And it's more into this, what I've talked about before, about society being an entity that wants to reproduce itself. And so one of the ways that society creates order is through social institutions, which we've talked about before. And these social institutions meet the needs of the members of society by performing specific functions. So the education system gets us all reading and writing, and it also performs what we call latent functions, like teaching us to show up on time, teaching us to sit quietly and be bored and not scream, and kind of prepares us to go out into the world to deal with other kids. So it's not just about learning algebra and you know, who Harriet Tubman was. It's a has more, you know, it's like teaching the elevator. There's a lot more going on. So functionalism tends to be positive about the world and about society. So it's, you know, everything's not great, but the system basically works. And, you know, there are dysfunctions, there are issues, but, you know, we need to not, you know, throw the baby out with the bathwater and, you know, act like everything needs to be overhauled. There are things that need to be fixed, but the basic system works. So functionalists tend to be positive, and then they also tend to believe in something called positivism. And positivism is the idea that when you go to study social phenomenon, or the different things that we study in sociology, that it's possible and that you want to be value free. So you want to look at whatever you're studying and remove your feelings and perspective from what you're studying. And we try to do that, and it can be very difficult if you're, for example, doing interviews with women who have had an abortion, and you are against abortion. It can be difficult. Or if you are, you know, interviewing people who are against abortion and you're for abortion, or you're for people who are pro-choice, they're not for abortion, but for the option to have an abortion, then you can see how it would be a difficult thing. I kind of laughed when I said that, because I listened to this extremely religious right-wing radio. If you're ever interested, it's at 88.1, and it's American Family Radio. And I listened to it because I am interested in how they see the world, and they talk a lot about abortion, and they say what I just said, that people are for abortion, that, you know, the people who are pro-choice are like really want people to go out and get abortions, the way you know, want people to go out and get their teeth cleaned, and it's not a very realistic perspective of that side of the fence. So functionalism focuses on how the system is stable over time, and we all have our place in it, and life is good. So functionalism, you can maybe see, like, has some of the conservative perspective kind of built into it, that, you know, if the system's basically working and you're not succeeding, there might be something going on with you, right? So, you know, we can't just hold the system responsible for everything. And so it tends to have that kind of conservative by nature. And this would be the conservative perspective that we try to create as much freedom and opportunity as possible, and then everyone's effort will determine where they end up. And then conflict theory, which is rooted in the work of Karl Marx, who's over here with his beard, is the second macro level theory, and it's at the total other end of the continuum. Conflict theory is angry. Conflict theory does not believe it's possible to look at anything without bringing your values and beliefs to the table. And the core of conflict theory is the inevitable conflict between the haves and the have-nots. And it's very critical of the system, the way that it's set up, and does not believe that the system is, an equal and open playing field where everyone can get ahead. And Karl Marx was very critical of capitalism and believed that it not only creates inequality, but it perpetuates it and it makes it grow. So the longer a capitalist system is in place, the more and more and more and more and more inequality there's going to be. And he was talking during a time when the workers were coming into the factories from the farms, and you had factories being built, and it was kind of a new paradigm for people to come and sell their labor and use the money to buy things rather than making them on their own or having the kind of interdependence you had in a rural lifestyle. And so you have the bourgeoisie, who you typically hear that they own the means of production, and that at that point that they own the factory. And now it's the people who are at the top of the corporations, the people who have the purse strings in hand. And if you've heard the term bougie, that comes from the bourgeoisie. And so these are the wealthy people who control how things are in society and make the rules to benefit themselves and make the rules to their advantage. So they are, by definition, in conflict with the proletariat, who are the workers, and because they want as much work out of the worker for as little money as possible, whereas the workers seek a living wage and meaningful work. And meaningful work in general is inefficient, and capitalism hates inefficiency. So if you, for example, are a seamstress and you make a skirt, that can be a meaningful job, right? You make it and then you might see someone in it. My grandmother used to make all her clothes because she said she didn't want to walk into herself out in the world. She wanted to see someone wearing the same outfit. So you can make a skirt, but if you make a skirt, that requires a lot of skill. You have to know how to do all the different components of making a skirt. And so it can be meaningful, but it's inefficient because that requires a craftsman or craftsperson. So what's much more efficient is to take that job and break it down into tasks. And you want the tasks to be simple so that you can quickly train someone how to do it, and so that it can be done by the least skilled person possible, so that you can, just throw people at the job, and anyone who quits, you just throw in the next person, right? So you create this kind of system. So one of the ways that that's done is you teach a person to sew the left hem of the skirt, let's say the left side hem. And so one person sits all day sewing left hems, right? And so each person does a part of the skirt. And doing it that way, you can make 10 times the number of skirts that you would have made with one person. And so that's much more profitable. And what happens to the workers is that the pay goes down because it no longer requires skill, and the meaning goes down because you're no longer making something. You're just kind of a cog in a wheel. And this makes life suck, right? This is, a shitty way to live. And so Marx believed that in order to make us live this way and put up with this, that we needed to develop what he called false consciousness. And false consciousness is that we learn that the system is fair, right? So we're taught, like through the media and in school, that capitalism is the best system in the universe, and that we have this amazing system and economy. And if you're poor, if you don't have gas to put in your car, that's really about you. And people say, well, what do you mean $15 an hour to work at McDonald's? And if you do that, then they're just going to bring in robots to take the orders. And which made me laugh. When I was living in Oregon, McDonald's tried outsourcing the people who took your order at the speaker, and they had people in India do it, right? Because it's not like you touch the person who takes your order, so why can't they be in India, right? So, I mean, if the corporations could use robots and outsource the jobs, they would already. But it just didn't work. Like, it made people nuts, right? Because it was just too weird for them to handle, and they stopped. But they tried. So we see on television, all these people with white collar jobs who are wealthy, who live in beautiful houses, and it's kind of like, okay, so this is how the world is, and it's not how the world is. But we kind of learn and believe that it's all fair. And we accept the fact that you can work a full-time job and not be able to live, right? And I mean, that's really the norm, right? You can work a full-time job, work hard, and not be able to put a roof over your head. And we accept that as normal because the people in power, the people who are making the money, are the ones who control all the information that we get. And Marx said that the religion was the opiate of the masses, that people needed something to comfort them from this horrible, meaningless life, and that eventually we would develop class consciousness and become aware of how evil the system is, and there would be a revolution. But Karl Marx never saw the cell phone coming, because now there's everybody's just asleep and on a cell phone, and nobody's thinking about the system being unfair. And one of the things that happens is that the wealthy pit the poor against the poorer, or you take the middle class and you have them blame the poor for your problems rather than looking upward, right? So that keeps the attention off the upper class, and they can continue to profit off the suffering and misery of the lower class. So like in the film The Plea, you can have people making money off people's misery, and these are people who don't have a voice. So my daughter's mother was recently in jail, and when you're in jail, they charge you $3 a day to be in jail, which seems like nothing, but when you have nothing, it's a lot. So every time you put money on their books, they take out $3 for every day you're in. And then the telephone system is controlled by a corporation, and a for-profit corporation, and it's expensive, And the only way you have to call the people is to put money on the phone system. And, you know, everything is controlled, like the scheduling, the visit scheduling system is another corporate website. You know, they've bought software to schedule. You know, there's just money, money, money. Anyway, so, but we're all too busy looking at Facebook or whatever you look at. So the macro level theories look at the big picture. Functionalism is pretty happy. Conflict theory is not. Symbolic interactionism comes down to the ground. Symbolic interactionism is not angry. It's not mad. It doesn't have a paradigm. Right? It's not coming to the table with a perspective. It's curious about how we create and maintain society through our day-to-day interactions and the meanings that we give things. So, for example, all the rules in the elevator, right? So how we act towards things based on meanings that we've been taught. And the meanings of things are not inherent, and they can be changed. So if you think about the wedding ring, you know, there's nothing inherent in a wedding ring on your left hand on that particular finger, meaning marriage. We do that in our culture. And it used to be that ring meant heterosexual marriage, and now it can mean a homosexual marriage. So the meanings of our symbols can change over time. Like certain cars, you know, go in and out of style, clothing, or different kinds of music. So the meanings that we have are different. So here's a little table. I'm going to put it on the next page. So the three perspectives visualized: structural functionalism, conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, and social change. Should sociology try and change the world? Only one thinks yes, and that's conflict theory. Conflict theory thinks that sociologists, with the knowledge that we have, should be engaged and involved in human rights, in anti-poverty work, and trying to make the world a better place. So the other, so here's a table that looks at the family in terms of the three different perspectives. This perspective also includes feminism, and feminism is an outshoot of conflict theory, which also looks at the conflicts between the haves and the have-nots. But in this case, instead of focusing as so much on assets, it focuses on gender. So I'm not going to talk about the feminist part, but I'm going to talk about the main part. So the family, how do they look at the family? So functionalism. The family is a social institution that helps society organize, reproduce. Families are responsible for teaching kids how to function in society, all the norms and all the values, and it's the needs of the family are, you know, are all aligned with the things. I mean, the needs of the members of the family are aligned with the things that the family can do. So the family teaches you literally how to survive, how to get food, how to, you know, get shelter, all the basic needs. So society needs us to learn those things, and families offer an environment for us to learn them. And when there's social change, if it happens too quickly, then, you know, bad things can happen. And in this case, you know, when the Supreme Court made its ruling about gay marriage, then, you know, that was what I heard a lot on the conservative radio, was that, you know, it was the end of the family, and it's part of the same energy for transgender, that, you know, this is a breakdown of our kind of core family norms, who's who, right? So conflict theory sees that the family is a way to create and maintain the benefits necessary for the wealthy. So for the wealthy, you have these groups called families, and the families do all this work for free, right? So if you go back to Thanksgiving and you think about everything that the women do to organize and make Thanksgiving happen, and none of that work is paid, and none of that work is valued. It's just tied in with, this is what it means to be a family. And so that's beneficial to the, you know, the dominant groups and institutions that we do this, right? It's helpful to them. Like, families deal with, you know, death and emergencies and crises, and you know, families help train their children in all the things that I was talking about expressive and instrumental tasks, and, you know, which helps keep men and women kind of on separate sides of a line. And you know, women came into the workforce particularly around the late 70s and 80s, and they came into the workforce, but none of their work at home changed. So women came into the workforce, but all of their work of taking care of the home stayed the same. And this benefits the corporations because, you know, they don't have to deal with it. They don't have to deal with, you know, people who are, you know, what to do with your kids, or what to do with your elderly parents, or anything. It just, all of that logistical work is pushed onto the family. So, you know, I've been homeschooling my daughter for the last 2 years, and she's almost 9, and, you know, so it's been, you know, really difficult to find places to put her, like when I just have like a 2-hour class that I need to go to, and I had to rely on babysitters and my parents sometimes, and, you know, because there's nowhere you can go. Like, why isn't there a place you can go to take kids to have quality care, you know, like on the weekends, like drop-in care? Why isn't there a place? It makes me want to open one. Or, you know, that we've just now have women doing all the work, but the workplace didn't change to accommodate them coming into it, so which benefits the corporation. So, and, you know, the only way that this is going to change is by force, right? So you're going to have, like, so we've had legislative change, right? The corporations are not going to change out of the goodness of their heart. When you hear changes made, like in places like Google, part of that is made to keep the high quality talents of the employees, right? There's competition for the people, the coders and project managers and high level skilled people for these corporations, and they want to keep the employees. And so they offer benefits that sound great, like they'll offer a benefit of unlimited vacation days, which one corporation did. And what they found when they offered unlimited vacation days is that people actually took fewer vacation days. So there were some people, like kind of slacker people, who kind of abused it and just, you know, took off all the time. And then the responsible people never took off because they felt guilty. They, you know, they never felt like they deserved to take off. So anyway, so symbolic interactionism is going to look at the family as it lives day to day. So it's going to look at the conversations between parents and children and how those conversations are involved in child development. It's going to, how the family is going to, in part, influence how the child feels and sees the world, how they navigate the world, the skills that they have or don't have when they go out as adults. So the family, it's going to be looking at what it's like in your house on a Thursday afternoon, or what happens in restaurants when you have families in restaurants. And it might, you know, look at day-to-day interactions. So it's not going to be looking at like families in terms of, you know, the structures of families and the, you know, like rates of unmarried mothers and other things like that. It's going to be looking at, you know, how do people argue, right? Which we'll be talking about next. So one last take on, if you want, on the conflict theory, symbolic interactionism, functionalism, if you want. This is a lecture by another professor that explains them. But the last task is to go in and take the concept of marriage, and I didn't make the link, take the concept of marriage and apply the three, and apply the three concepts to it. So how do, all right, I'm just messing myself up. Okay, how do the, how would a conflict theorist see the family, right? And how, I mean, would they see marriage? How would they look at marriage? So how would a conflict theorist look at marriage? How would a symbolic interactionist, what would they do? And then how would a functionalist? So a functionalist and a conflict theorist would be talking at the high level, and a symbolic interactionist would be, instead of like talking about marriage as a big concept, would be more likely to be talking about like weddings or other rituals around marriage. So anyway, so to take each of the perspectives and just give a stab. We're going to be talking about these perspectives forever. Give a stab at trying to show how they might look at marriage and kind of what would show up in their frame if they were looking at it. Okay, and that's it for this lecture.